It's been about 6 months now since the release of Pokemon Sword and Shield, and by now I've had plenty of time to experience the game. I personally really enjoyed playing through the game, however that doesn't mean that there aren't things I would like to see improved upon or even changed. Like most, my expectations were rather high when it comes to seeing a first new generation main series Pokemon game on the Switch, but my expectations were still pretty realistic. I just want to remind you guys before the start of the video that if you enjoy this video, make sure you click that like button as it really does go a long way, really does support me, and subscribe if you haven't already if you want to see some of my future videos. According to YouTube, over 90% of people who watch my videos aren't even subscribed. I know this is all cliche and you might be tired of hearing it all over the place, but I wouldn't be saying it if it didn't make a huge difference in supporting the channel. A lot of what I'm going to discuss doesn't have much to do with the actual core gameplay of Sword and Shield, but more so just the extra features. I personally really enjoyed playing through the regular story mode of Sword and Shield, collecting all the badges, and defeating the Elite Four, and it was one of the most fun I've ever had playing a Pokemon game, at least the most fun I've had since playing Black and White for the first time back in 2011. Now, one of the biggest issues for me personally with Sword and Shield is the online battle timer. I was very big into competitive Pokemon battling, in Generation 6 and 7 especially, while typically doing 6v6 single battles with a 60-minute timer in those games. It wasn't very common for games to be decided by timer back in those generations, since an hour is a very good amount of time for a battle. However, for whatever reason, they decided to cut that timer all the way down to 20 minutes in Sword and Shield. 20 minutes is far too short, resulting in a lot of battles being decided by the timer. This small feature was enough to kill most of my interest in competitive battling in Sword and Shield, which is why I haven't done it nearly as much as I have in previous generations. I have heard there are slight workarounds and fixes to extend the timer a little bit and have more of like a chess timer to make it a bit more fair, but I still don't see a reason why we couldn't have at least had our own timer, or at least just set the timer to 60 minutes like we had in previous generations. Something as simple as just being able to pick a timer so you make it as little as say a minute or as long as an hour would really go a long way. When it comes to Pokemon games, more so than any other games I've played, they've always been held to a standard of having some sort of post-game related story content once completing the main game by defeating the Elite Four and the Champion. When we break it down like that, to expect a game to have more story content after completing the story, it does sound a bit ridiculous, but ever since we had the ability to travel back to the Kanto region way back in Pokemon Gold and Silver, it became expected in Pokemon main series games. Obvious spoiler warnings ahead since we are talking about Sword and Shield post-game, but there really isn't much there. There's these two guys who are after Zacian and Zamazenta, and you have to catch them before they do, and that's pretty much it. To be honest, I never even bothered with completing this since it was one of the more uninteresting post-games to me, and probably the most uninteresting post-game in Pokemon ever since the Looker missions in X and Y, which I never bothered completing either. One of the more popular requests is for a proper Battle Frontier-like system, similar to what we saw in Pokemon Emerald or Platinum version. These are more fun than just regular single battle towers in my opinion, especially in the case of Pokemon Emerald, with each battle area having different battle rules. And now for the big one, the National Dex. I really don't want to turn this into anything negative or anything that it's really not meant to be, as I do think there has been a lot of information blown out of proportion on both sides and have a ton of lies and misinformation that have spawned out of it, especially with all the Twitter spam, so let's try and keep this a little more civil. When I first heard that Pokemon Sword and Shield wouldn't have all of the Pokemon included in it, I was a bit confused. Mainly because we haven't really ever had this before, and also because the announcement came during a Treehouse Live Play event and not even during an actual Nintendo Direct or trailer, which was odd. Now that we know a bit more about this decision, I understand the reasoning, especially with some Pokemon coming back in future free DLC, but I think the main issue was with how it was handled rather than the lack of Pokemon itself. Prior to learning this information about the lack of Pokemon, there wasn't nearly as much negativity surrounding Pokemon Sword and Shield, and this was really what started it all. Now if you ask me if I had the option to include every single Pokemon in the game or not with no strings attached, if it was as simple as just pressing a button, I would definitely choose to include all Pokemon. It's something that doesn't really affect regular gameplay much at all, or even really affect me personally. But it still would be nice for a lot of other Pokemon fans, especially for people who enjoy creating national living dexes in their entire game, something I personally have never done or even really cared to do, or use more Pokemon in online battles. I guess that one potential positive from this is you won't see the same couple of Pokemon used over and over again in competitive battles, and as much as people like to downplay this, it did allow Game Freak to focus on other things with the Switch, as it is a drastically different console for the 3DS when it comes to making a game. This next point is related to the missing Pokemon a little, And that's the inclusion of more legendary Pokemon. I think it's odd that the only legendary Pokemon that are catchable in Sword and Shield are Eteranus and the cover legendary, with no special legendary tree like we've seen in previous generations, or other legendary Pokemon to go with from older games. Including a couple of older legendary Pokemon would have been really nice to give you something a little extra to do once defeating the main story, but at least we have some of that made up with the upcoming DLC. We still have to wait and see how good this DLC is and if it's even worth buying, since we don't really know too much about it right now despite just being about a month away, so hopefully it's pretty good. Some people are going to argue that the DLC should have been free because of this, but seeing as pretty much every other major gaming franchise has had some form of paid DLC for the last 10 years or so, I think we should at least wait and see before judging it. Now I did make a separate video for this next point alone, so be sure to check it out if you're interested, which I'll link in the description. Team Yell sort of acts as the evil team for Pokemon Sword and Shield, except they don't really do anything evil. They follow around one of your rivals, Marnie, and get in your way a little bit here and there with a couple of battles, but they don't really have any real motive or any real purpose, to be honest. It would have been nice to have them, or maybe even some other evil team that was actually evil, and have their own little story to go along with it, sort of like what we've seen with Team Aqua and Team Magma in the past, or even Team Rocket. I definitely don't want something to the extent of Pokemon Sun and Moon's evil teams where they took up way too much of the plot in the gameplay, but something to make them a little bit more memorable and at least have a purpose. We did have part of Chairman Rose's company revealed to be evil towards the end of the game, but that was only for a very short amount of time and not that much information was even given. There's still a lot of lore and backstory behind Chairman Rose and his assistant Oleana which go unexplained in the games and are found elsewhere. Maybe again this will be fixed in future DLCs for Sword and Shield, or maybe even a future game based off of Sword and Shield if they make an Emerald or Black and White 2 type game for this region. One thing I did notice about Sword and Shield, however, is how long it took me to complete the main game. I ended up beating the main game on my very first playthrough in just about 16 hours, which is a bit shorter than normal. Typically, my very first Pokemon playthroughs take about 18 to 20 hours to complete. I didn't rush through the game either, as I did spend some time in the wild area and exploring some other things and even catching some Pokemon. I have even heard of people beating the game in as quickly as 14 hours, although in those cases they were usually just rushing through the game without stopping and doing anything extra to complete it as fast as possible. It would have been nice to have just a little bit extra more to do in the main game and the actual story, which could have been achieved if there was a more focus on an evil team like I mentioned earlier, or if there were some other events added within the game. I remember there being a rumor for Pokemon Sword and Shield a few months ago where there would be more than 8 gym badges in the games. Something like that would have been a very nice way to extend the game a little bit, even if it was just 1 or 2 extra gym badges. One popular theory leading up to the release of Pokemon Sword and Shield was that there could possibly have been some sort of connection with the Kalos region in X and Y. Galar, or the region in Sword and Shield, is based off of the real-world United Kingdom after all, and Kalos is based off of France, both of which are close in the real world, so it would have made sense assuming the 2 regions are still close within the Pokemon world. Out of all of the Pokemon games, X and Y are the ones that seem the most unfinished, with Zygarde not getting any backstory until Sun and Moon, and even then it was kinda just tacked on there, and a few areas of the Kalos region like the power plant remaining unused and having areas that you can't even access. It always seemed like there was something more to Kalos, or at least something meant to be there in some sort of way, and Sword and Shield would have been a pretty nice way to cap things off. I can't really be too upset though, since this really isn't an issue with Sword and Shield itself, it's more of a fault with X and Y, but it would have been a nice way to properly give closure to the Kalos region if they included it in some way, shape, or form in Pokemon Sword and Shield. And lastly, I just briefly wanted to discuss a couple of smaller features that I don't really care about personally, but it is something I have heard talked about. First and foremost, Pokemon following you. We saw this in Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee a little bit, and it is a nice, cute, cool little feature, but definitely not anything that's game-breaking or makes me too upset that Pokemon don't follow you. Would have also been cool to have some sort of secret base feature like we've seen in a couple of other games. We had secret bases in 3rd generation, as well as the underground bases, which I thought were pretty cool in Diamond and Pearl. Seeing something like that in Sword and Shield would have been rather nice, especially with the online capabilities that could have happened in the game. I imagine that having an underground like Diamond and Pearl in Sword and Shield would have been a lot better than it was originally in Diamond and Pearl, especially since you could have a lot more mini games, but unfortunately we don't really have anything like that. So these are just a few things that I would personally change about Pokemon Sword and Shield if I could. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who disagree or have other changes they would like to make, so please let me know in the comment section down below what you think. Make sure you leave a like as well if you enjoyed the video, as it does help the channel a lot and go a long way, and subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss a future upload if you want to see future videos from me. With all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. I will see you all next time, and bye-bye.